France was on the edge. The kingdom was still standing, but it no longer felt solid. On the surface, France remained vast, rich, and crowned with all the symbols of medieval grandeur. Cathedrals still cast their stone shadows over crowded squares. Nobles still rode beneath bright banners. Kings still wore silk and gold and spoke as if history itself moved at their command. Yet beneath that glittering surface, something had begun to fail. The old certainty that had once held the French monarchy together was slipping away. And into that uncertainty stepped the House of Valois. They did not enter history like a conquering dynasty, all thunder and triumph. They entered as an answer to a problem no one had fully solved. The direct royal line had broken. The crown had to pass somewhere. France, enormous and proud, could not remain leaderless. So the Valois arrived not as legends already made, but as relatives called forward by crisis, asked to hold the throne at the very moment it seemed most difficult to keep. That was the danger from the beginning. The Valois inherited a kingdom that was still magnificent, but no longer simple. The old medieval order was beginning to strain under the weight of legal dispute, foreign ambition, military change, and a growing sense that the world was becoming harsher, faster, and less obedient to custom than before. Every royal decision would now be measured against disaster. Every victory would come with new risks. Every loss would echo longer than the last. The dynasty's story would become a long struggle to answer one brutal question. How does a family keep a kingdom together when nearly every force around it seems determined to tear it apart? The answer would unfold across battlefields, plague-stricken cities, coronation halls, council chambers, and burning towns. It would involve kings who were too weak, kings who were too proud, kings who were brilliant but unlucky, and kings who were forced to rule in a century that seemed to punish certainty. The House of Valois would survive by adapting, by enduring humiliation, by learning to rebuild after collapse, and by discovering that survival in France meant more than wearing the crown. It meant convincing others that the crown still mattered. That struggle began at the moment France realized it could not simply continue as before. Before the Valois could become a dynasty, they had to become a necessity. The old royal line had narrowed to a dangerous point, and the question of who should inherit France was no longer a matter of neat succession, but of fear, pride, law, and power. One branch of the family had ended. Another stood waiting in the wings. Across the Channel, England watched closely, ready to press a claim that could redraw the political map of Western Europe. Inside France, nobles and jurists argued over bloodlines, as if the fate of the kingdom could be settled by memory alone. It could not. The crown was passing into uncertain hands, and that uncertainty would shape everything that followed. The next chapter begins there, with a broken inheritance, a disputed throne, and a dynasty that stepped forward just as the kingdom began to wobble. France did not wake up one morning and suddenly become a kingdom in crisis. The fracture came slowly, then all at once. For generations, the Capetian kings had relied on a form of continuity that seemed almost natural. The throne passed from father to son. Coronation followed death. Death followed rule. The pattern repeated with such regularity that the monarchy began to look less like a human institution and more like a feature of the landscape, as permanent as rivers or hills. That illusion made the crisis more dangerous when it came. It began with a family line that thinned too quickly. Philip IV, powerful and severe, had built a monarchy larger, richer, and more assertive than many of his predecessors could have imagined. But the line of direct succession did not hold. One son after another died without leaving surviving male heirs who could inherit cleanly under the expectations of the time. The kingdom found itself staring into a problem it had long assumed belonged to other realms. What happens when the king's bloodline runs out? That question was not merely legal. It was political dynamite. In a feudal world, blood mattered because blood created obligation. It justified obedience. It gave the crown its sacred shape. If the line of inheritance could be disputed, then everything built on that line could be disputed too. Nobles who had sworn loyalty might begin to wonder whether their loyalty still carried the same meaning. Provinces that had accepted royal authority might begin to test its limits. Foreign rulers, always watching for weakness, would see opportunity where others saw confusion. At the center of that storm stood Philip of Valois. He was not the son of a reigning king. He was not the obvious heir in the modern sense. He was a cousin, a man from the royal family's broader and less direct branch, chosen because the kingdom needed a male successor who could be defended as legitimate. In 1328, he became Philip VI. With that coronation, the House of Valois began. The moment was triumphant on paper and fragile in reality. A coronation can make a king, but it cannot erase doubt. Philip VI inherited the symbols of monarchy, yet not all the certainty that once surrounded them. Across the Channel, Edward III of England watched the crisis closely. Through his mother, Isabella of France, Edward possessed a connection to the French royal line that could not be dismissed lightly in a world where dynastic claims were often argued with parchment and steel alike. If inheritance could pass through female descent, Edward had a case. If it could not, then Philip did. That distinction mattered more than any theologian or jurist might have liked to admit, because the issue was never only law. It was power wrapped in law. France did not want an English king. The idea itself was intolerable to many nobles and clerics who understood that a foreign crown on the French throne could upend the balance of Europe. A map of the kingdom at this moment would show a vast, uneven land still held together by royal prestige rather than by complete administrative control. Royal authority was strongest near Paris and the Île-de-France. But farther out, the kingdom became more complicated. Great lords ruled their own lands with entrenched independence. Border regions looked outward as much as inward. The crown had influence everywhere, but absolute control nowhere. This was the world Philip VI inherited, and it was already dangerous before the first arrows flew. The new king's greatest challenge was not just to rule, but to be accepted as a king in the fullest sense. He needed to convince France that the Valois were not an emergency solution, but a rightful continuation of the royal story. Every public act of kingship, every procession, every judgment, every declaration of war or peace would become part of that effort. The dynasty had to perform stability before it could actually achieve it. Yet the more Philip acted like a powerful monarch, the more he drew the attention of rivals. Edward III's claims could not be ignored forever. The simmering friction between the French and English crowns deepened. Trade, territory, and honor all fed the dispute. But beneath them lay something more dangerous. Neither ruler could easily back down without appearing weak before his own nobles. This was how dynastic disputes became wars. The House of Valois was therefore born into contradiction. It needed peace to consolidate authority, but peace itself might be interpreted as weakness. It needed strength to command respect, but displays of strength risked provoking the very conflict that could expose its inexperience. Every choice carried a cost. Every delay could be read as hesitation. Every move forward could become a step toward catastrophe. At first, the danger seemed manageable. it was not. The kingdom's broken inheritance had not simply produced a new royal house. It had opened the door to an era in which the crown would have to fight for everything it claimed to possess. And once that door opened, the wars came through it. The Valois had received a crown whose legitimacy could still be argued and whose enemies were already sharpening their arguments into weapons. What followed was not a single clash, but the beginning of a long and punishing struggle in which France would have to defend not only its territory, but the very idea that it could be ruled from within rather than challenged from without. Edward III was not merely a rival monarch. He was a living reminder that dynastic uncertainty could become international war in a heartbeat. Let's now move into that widening storm. The moment when legal doubt hardened into military ambition, when the English claim stopped being a theory and became a threat, and when the Valois discovered that a disputed throne could drag an entire kingdom into decades of fire. The war did not begin with a single trumpet blast. It began the way many great disasters begin in history, with arguments that could not be settled, pride that could not be softened, and rulers who understood the stakes too well to surrender them. By the time the conflict widened into what later generations would call the 100 Years' War, the question was no longer whether France and England were uneasy neighbors. It was whether one crown could survive the existence of the other claim. A map of Western Europe at the beginning of the struggle would show why the conflict became so difficult to contain. English possessions were not confined to the island kingdom. They stretched across parts of southern France through Aquitaine and other holdings inherited through old dynastic arrangements. The Channel did not separate two completely distinct worlds. It connected them. That made the war more than a border quarrel. It made it a struggle inside a tangled political landscape where kings ruled lands, not neat nation-states. And that meant every battlefield decision had consequences far beyond the battlefield itself. Philip VI needed early success. He needed to show the nobility that the Valois could defend the realm. He needed to prove that the French crown was not a temporary placeholder. The pressure mounted quickly. English campaigns tested French defenses. Naval clashes spread uncertainty across the coast. Alliances shifted in ways that made every diplomatic victory feel provisional. Then came Crécy in 1346. The battle is often remembered because it felt like a rupture. The old logic of chivalric warfare, with its emphasis on mounted nobility and heroic charge, met a colder reality. The French army, proud and heavily armored, pressed forward against English defensive positions. The longbowmen, disciplined and deadly, tore into the advancing lines. Horses collapsed, men fell. The air filled with noise, panic, and the terrible confusion of a force discovering that courage alone would not save it. For the French aristocracy, this was more than a defeat. It was humiliation. The nobility had long imagined itself as the military spine of the kingdom. At Crécy, that assumption cracked. A battle that should have confirmed French superiority instead exposed the vulnerability of an elite that had mistaken tradition for invincibility. The king's side did not simply lose troops. It lost a story about itself. That loss mattered, because once an elite begins to doubt its own military identity, the entire political structure beneath it starts to shake. Nobles who survive battlefield disasters begin to question leadership. Taxpayers begin to resent the cost. Rivals begin to wonder whether the crown still commands loyalty through strength or merely through habit. The fall of Calais sharpened the wound. The siege was slow, exhausting, and deeply symbolic. When the city finally surrendered, it became a permanent English foothold on French soil. A map of the war after Calais would look different in a way that mattered psychologically as much as strategically. England was no longer merely raiding France. It was holding territory with a grim, stubborn permanence. That mattered to France because territory is never just land in a dynastic war. It is a visible argument about legitimacy. Then came the plague. If Crécy had wounded the kingdom's pride, the Black Death attacked its body. The disease moved across Europe with terrifying speed, carrying away the living so quickly that the world itself seemed to lose faith in continuity. Villages thinned, cities slowed, priests buried the dead almost as fast as they were prayed over. Fields went untended, families disappeared. The social fabric of France, already strained by war, began to unravel under a calamity no king could command and no army could defeat. The timing was devastating. France did not have the luxury of recovering from military humiliation before facing demographic collapse. The plague robbed the realm of labor, revenue, and confidence. It made every previous decision look smaller. Even the grand disputes of kings suddenly seemed fragile in the face of a world where death could arrive in a household without warning and take nearly everyone. The Valois had inherited a kingdom that needed strong kings. Instead, they inherited a century of emergencies. Philip VI's reign revealed the central problem of the dynasty early. The Valois could not afford to be ordinary. Every setback became a test of legitimacy. Every failure was interpreted not as one king's misfortune, but as proof that the dynasty itself was under strain. In a more stable age, a king might recover from defeat. In this one, defeat seemed to multiply. And still the war continued, because by then it had become larger than Philip VI, larger than Edward III, larger than even the original legal dispute. It had become a contest over the shape of French monarchy itself. Could the kingdom remain whole under pressure? Could royal authority survive in a land where major nobles had their own ambitions, where foreign powers could intervene, and where war and plague together made the old medieval world feel suddenly brittle? The answer was not yet clear. What was clear was that the Valois could not stop now. To stop would mean surrendering the throne's moral energy. To continue meant risking more humiliations. The dynasty had entered a war it could not easily win, yet could not safely escape. That is where the next crisis would arrive. Not from the battlefield alone, but from the capture of a king, the collapse of confidence, and the terrifying realization that even the crown itself could be taken prisoner. By the middle of the war, France was no longer asking whether it could win cleanly. It was asking whether it could survive at all. The disasters of the early campaigns had weakened royal confidence, but the next blow would be more intimate and more destabilizing. A king would be seized. The crown would be shamed. The kingdom would discover that a ruler's body could become a battlefield in itself, and that captivity could do what armies sometimes could not: strip power of its aura in a single, brutal moment. If Crécy had shaken the French nobility, Poitiers broke something deeper. On the field in 1356, the kingdom suffered not just another military defeat, but an outrage against royal dignity itself. King John II, known later as John the Good, rode into the crisis as though courage and chivalry could still stabilize the world. He was a warrior king in a century that still admired warrior kings, and that was part of the tragedy. He believed the old language of honor could still command the outcome. It could not. The battle turned against France with brutal speed. English forces, disciplined and tactically superior, held their ground while French attacks fractured under pressure. Dust, shouting, and confusion filled the field. Noble hopes collapsed into disaster. Then came the blow that changed everything. The king was captured. A king taken prisoner was not merely a military embarrassment. It was a symbolic catastrophe. The image alone was unbearable. The French monarch, living center of the realm, the man around whom laws, oaths, and loyalties revolved, was now physically in enemy hands. In a world where kings embodied the state, captivity meant more than humiliation. It meant the kingdom itself had been made vulnerable in the most intimate way possible. The crown had been touched, seized, and carried away. A map of France in the aftermath would show not just land and borders, but strain everywhere. English-held zones tightened their grip. French loyalties grew uncertain. Cities braced for taxation. Rural communities faced pressure from roaming soldiers and collapsing order. The monarchy's authority no longer felt distant and majestic. It felt exposed. John II's ransom became one of the great burdens of the age. Releasing a captured king required enormous wealth, and that wealth had to come from a kingdom already weakened by war and plague. The price of royal freedom was therefore paid by subjects who could least afford it. Taxation deepened resentment. Every demand from the crown sounded harsher now, because the crown seemed to have failed in its first duty: to protect. In Paris, tension boiled over. The city became a theater of anger, fear, and political calculation. Merchants and burghers demanded reform. Nobles argued over responsibility. The royal government, weak and discredited, struggled to maintain control. Etienne Marcel emerged as a force of resistance, speaking for urban interests and challenging the old order of princely privilege. What he wanted was not simply disorder. He wanted a kingdom in which power could be restrained, checked, and made more accountable. But in a crisis like this, reform and rebellion often look alike from a distance. Meanwhile, the countryside erupted in the Jacquerie, one of the most violent peasant uprisings of medieval France. Exhausted by war, taxes, and insecurity, peasants lashed out at the nobility that had failed to protect them. Castles were attacked. Aristocratic households were terrorized. The social hierarchy that had long defined medieval life suddenly looked less like an unshakable order and more like a structure under siege. This mattered because it revealed the true danger of the Valois crisis. France was not only losing battles, it was losing trust. That loss of trust spread in both directions. Nobles feared the people. The people feared the nobility. Cities feared the countryside. The crown feared everyone. In such an atmosphere, even survival became political. Each faction imagined that the others were profiting from chaos. Each faction believed it was defending the kingdom from collapse. That is how a state begins to split along invisible lines long before it formally tears apart. John II eventually died in captivity before the ransom crisis could be fully resolved, leaving behind not closure, but another opening. The throne passed to his son, Charles V, a man of sharper intelligence and quieter temperament. He was not a battlefield hero. He was something more useful in the long run, a patient ruler. And patience, in that century, was a form of strategy. Charles V understood that the kingdom could not be restored through theatrical bravery alone. France needed administration, discipline, and caution. He worked through trusted advisors, relied on capable commanders, and avoided the reckless grandeur that had helped ruin earlier efforts. One of the most important of those commanders was Bertrand du Guesclin, whose military methods reflected the new reality of war. This was no longer an age in which noble charge alone could solve problems. Caution, maneuver, and endurance mattered more. Charles V's reign began the slow recovery of the monarchy. Little by little, the crown reclaimed authority. English momentum was checked. Fortresses changed hands. Royal finances were managed more carefully. Diplomacy became as important as combat. The king did not transform France overnight, and that was precisely why his work mattered. He gave the dynasty something it had rarely enjoyed for long: a chance to breathe. A timeline of this period would show not a clean rise, but a jagged climb. Defeat, capture, unrest, reform, and then gradual stabilization. The pattern matters because it reveals the nature of Valois' survival. They did not bounce back in a single leap. They recovered by refusing to collapse completely. Still, the kingdom remained fragile. Charles V's achievements depended on discipline, and discipline always contains its own weakness. It can outlast the ruler who creates it only if the next generation is equally careful. That was far from certain. When Charles died, France would again be vulnerable to personality, faction, and fortune. The dynasty had survived captivity. It had survived humiliation. It had survived riots, revolt, and near breakdown. But the deeper conflicts that had been exposed in the process did not disappear. They waited. Beneath the surface of restored authority, old grievances still smoldered. Powerful nobles still resented central control. Urban leaders still wanted a stronger voice. The crown still depended on fragile loyalties. The kingdom was stronger than it had been after Poitiers, but it was not united in any deep sense. It had been patched together, not healed. And the next phase of the story would prove that those fractures had not gone away. The recovery under Charles V gave the Valois a reprieve, not a cure. France looked steadier from the outside, but beneath that steadiness, the old rivalries had only been contained, not resolved. Kings, nobles, cities, and regional powers had all learned during the crisis that the monarchy could be challenged. They had also learned that the monarchy could recover. That made every future struggle more dangerous, because everyone now understood how close the kingdom had come to the edge. France enters a tense, unstable world. Royal weakness invited factions, where succession no longer guaranteed obedience, and where the kingdom began to argue with itself almost as fiercely as it once argued with England. France did not fall apart all at once. It came undone in layers. First, the war weakened the throne. Then plague thinned the population. Then ransom, taxes, and exhaustion stripped confidence from every level of society. By the time the kingdom reached this next phase, the danger no longer came only from English armies across the Channel. It came from the French themselves. That was a terrible turn. A kingdom can survive an enemy outside its walls if its people still believe in the same center. It can survive invasion, siege, even humiliation, so long as there remains a sense that the crown is the vessel of national continuity. But once the court begins to fracture, once noble houses begin to form rival camps, once the realm starts arguing with itself about who has the right to govern, the crisis changes shape. It becomes not just a war, but a struggle over the soul of the state. That was the France inherited by Charles VI. At first, his reign seemed capable of stability. The monarchy had regained some strength under Charles V. The kingdom had not been restored to perfect peace, but it had recovered enough to imagine that the worst might be over. That hope did not last. Charles VI's mental illness shattered the fragile confidence of the court. A king who cannot reliably govern forces everyone around him to govern in his place, and that creates a vacuum where ambition rushes in. The court became a battlefield of influence. Advisors, uncles, rivals, and great lords all tried to shape the kingdom around the void at the center. A simple map of France during these years would not just mark territory. it would reveal zones of loyalty, zones of suspicion, and zones where authority had become more theatrical than real. The crown still existed, but it no longer felt alone. Two great factions emerged in the shadow of the king's weakness. The Burgundians, powerful and politically astute, built their own base of influence. The Armagnacs gathered around the rival interests that opposed them. What began as court competition hardened into open, factional violence. This was no longer merely about who advised the king. It was about who controlled the future of France if the king failed to recover. And beneath that struggle was a more dangerous truth. Many nobles were beginning to think in terms of survival rather than loyalty. If the crown could not guarantee order, then noble families would seek their own protection. If the state could not enforce unity, then local power would reassert itself. Every choice became strategic, not principled. Every alliance was conditional. The assassination of Louis of Orleans in 1407 made that danger visible. He was not simply a man removed from the board. He was a political act made flesh. His murder signaled that the feud had crossed from rivalry into blood vengeance. Once that line was crossed, compromise became much harder. His allies sought justice. His enemies feared punishment. And the kingdom became trapped in a cycle where every act of retaliation justified the next one. A timeline of the period would not look like a smooth sequence of rulers and decrees. It would look like a fracture map. Here, an assassination. There, a counter-alliance. Here, a treaty. There, a betrayal. Then war within the war. Then negotiation. Then collapse again. That jaggedness is not an accident of storytelling. It is the reality of political breakdown. The English understood this very well. A divided France was a more useful target than a united one. Rival factions opened doors, invited intervention, and weakened the crown's ability to respond. The English were not merely invading an enemy kingdom. They were stepping into a political wound already bleeding from within. For the Valois, this made the conflict even more humiliating. Their own internal divisions were helping their foreign enemy. Then came Agincourt in 1415. The battle is remembered because it was shocking in its cruelty and clarity. French nobility, confident in its numbers and prestige, faced an English force that was smaller, exhausted, and strategically superior in its chosen ground. Mud slowed movement. Confusion spread. Horses struggled. Armor became a burden. The battlefield turned into a killing field. Once again, the old assumptions of aristocratic warfare proved disastrously inadequate. Agincourt mattered not only because France lost, but because it confirmed a terrifying pattern. The kingdom could lose battles abroad while still tearing itself apart at home. Defeat no longer came in one form. It came layered, one weakness feeding another. By now, the stakes were larger than any one army. If France remained divided, the Valois could lose the throne entirely. If the crown lost legitimacy, noble alliances might become permanent. If foreign intervention deepened, the kingdom could be reshaped by outsiders, while its own elite fought for scraps of authority. What was at risk was not just the territory of France, but the possibility that France might stop acting like a single political body. That is why this chapter feels so dangerous. The kingdom was not simply in trouble. It was losing its internal language of unity. The Valois line looked less like a dynasty and more like a question mark. And then, when everything seemed to be drifting toward permanent collapse, France received something it had nearly forgotten how to recognize. A chance. Not from a council chamber, not from a treaty, not from a great noble house. From a girl in armor, riding toward a kingdom that no longer believed in itself. By the early 1420s, France looked less like a unified kingdom than a landscape of competing claims and fading loyalties. The English held immense power. Burgundy stood beside them. Paris was lost. The Dauphin remained uncrowned and uncertain. Even supporters of the Valois cause struggled to explain why hope still made sense. That was precisely why Joan of Arc mattered. She entered the story at the moment when military defeat had become psychological defeat. When France no longer simply feared losing battles, but feared losing the meaning of itself. The next chapter follows the astonishing rise of Joan, the revival of Charles VII's fortunes, and the moment when the impossible suddenly began to look achievable again. France had grown used to defeat. That was the atmosphere Joan of Arc entered. Not a kingdom celebrating recovery, but one trained by grief to expect disappointment. Years of war had made caution feel wiser than hope. Cities had learned to brace themselves. Courtiers had learned to hedge their loyalties. Soldiers had learned that courage alone did not guarantee survival. Even the idea of French victory had begun to sound like a memory from an older, more confident age. Then a peasant girl from Lorraine appeared with a claim that should have seemed impossible. She did not arrive with wealth, lineage, or military training. She arrived with conviction. In a court filled with caution and calculation, that alone made her extraordinary. Joan spoke as though the kingdom still mattered, as though France was not a broken thing, but a living one, still capable of rescue. To Charles VII's followers, she seemed astonishing. To his enemies, she seemed absurd. To a kingdom accustomed to humiliation, she seemed dangerous precisely because she made hope sound reasonable again. The power of Joan's story lay not only in what she said, but in what she made others do. She changed the emotional temperature of the war. France at this moment had the English pressing deep into the heart of the realm. Major cities and routes remained contested. Royal authority was narrow and fragile. The English-backed claim of Henry VI and the legitimacy of Charles VII stood in bitter opposition. The contest was not merely about land. It was about whose reality France would accept, whose crown would be seen as inevitable, whose future would be believed. Joan's arrival cut through that uncertainty. At Orléans, the siege had become more than a military problem. It had become a test of national endurance. If the city fell, the English would gain a powerful strategic and symbolic advantage. If it held, the possibility of recovery would remain alive. The stakes were enormous because Orléans stood like a threshold. Beyond it lay collapse. Beyond it also lay the possibility that France might still be saved. Joan rode into that siege with a sense of mission that disoriented everyone around her. She wore armor. She carried a banner. She spoke with a force that combined religiosity, urgency, and confidence. She did not behave like a courtly figure or a commander trained in the proper aristocratic fashion. That is part of why her presence mattered. She seemed to come from outside the system that had failed France, and yet she stepped directly into the center of its most desperate problem. The relief of Orléans changed everything. It did not end the war. It did not restore peace, but it shattered the paralysis of despair. A victory can do that. It can make the impossible look merely difficult. It can make a demoralized army remember its own strength. It can make a king believe in his own coronation. And Charles VII needed that belief. He had spent too much of his reign living inside uncertainty. His claim to the throne had long been challenged. His position had been weakened by divided nobles, by English pressure, and by the sheer exhaustion of the kingdom. The road to Reims, the traditional coronation city, was not just a route on a map. It was a symbolic corridor. To reach it meant more than military success. It meant recovering the language of legitimate kingship. Joan helped make that possible. The coronation at Reims was one of the great theatrical moments of the Valois dynasty. The cathedral, heavy with stone and memory, became a stage for renewal. The oil, the rituals, the sacred atmosphere, the gathered witnesses, all of it mattered because kingship in this age was not only political. It was ceremonial, sacramental, and public. Charles VII was not merely declared king. He was made visible as king in the old French sense, under the weight of tradition and the gaze of the realm. That mattered more than any single battlefield, because the war had always been about legitimacy as much as territory. A crowned king could command loyalty more effectively than a contested claimant. The ritual at Reims therefore transformed the meaning of the struggle. Charles VII now possessed a stronger claim in the eyes of his supporters, and perhaps more importantly, he possessed a story. France could once again imagine itself rallying around a center. But Joan's role was never going to remain simple. The same force that made her irresistible as a symbol also made her intolerable to those who feared disorder. She was not a noblewoman acting within familiar bounds. She was not a priest, not a prince, not a counselor. She was something harder to categorize, and therefore harder to control. Once the symbolic crisis of the moment passed, those around her began to see the danger of her continued presence. In a world built on hierarchy, she disrupted hierarchy merely by existing. Her capture, trial, and execution revealed that the return of hope can be fragile enough to shatter under the old machinery of power. Her death was both a tragedy and a warning. A kingdom can be revived emotionally before it is revived politically. Joan helped France believe again, but belief alone could not secure victory. The Valois would still need institutions, administration, military reform, and patient rule. They would need to turn the energy she awakened into something durable. Otherwise, her story would remain a miracle without a future. But it was not a miracle without a future. It became the beginning of one. Because after Joan, France was no longer only a kingdom recovering from defeat. It was a kingdom with a renewed sense that recovery was possible. That change in psychology mattered enormously. States are not built only with taxes and fortresses. They are also built with confidence, memory, and the belief that sacrifice can lead somewhere. Joan of Arc did not win the war by herself, but she made the war winnable again. And that was enough to alter history. Joan's life ended in fire, but the fire she carried did not die with her. It spread into the later Valois monarchy as a new seriousness about rule, strategy, and continuity. Charles VII could now begin the longer work of turning emotional rescue into political restoration. The kingdom still had enemies, but it also had a clearer sense of itself. What had once seemed broken could now be repaired, if the crown was willing to become more disciplined than it had been before. It enters the era when the Valois stop simply surviving crises and start building the machinery that might keep future crises from destroying them. France did not become strong again by accident. After the shock of Joan of Arc, after the humiliation of repeated defeat, after years in which royal authority had seemed like a fragile candle in a storm, the Valois finally began to understand what survival really required. It was not enough to win a battle. It was not enough to inspire a moment. It was not enough to wear the crown and hope the crown would do the rest. The kingdom needed structure. That was the quiet revolution of Charles VII's reign. He did not rule like a hero from romance. He ruled like a man who had seen how easily kingdoms break. that difference mattered. His reign was less about spectacle than repair, less about dramatic gestures than the slow accumulation of power. The Valois had learned, painfully, that charisma could lift a kingdom, but only administration could hold it together. France in this period would begin to look different from the fractured maps of earlier years. The royal center grew firmer. Lines of authority became clearer. Regions once dominated by rival powers came gradually under tighter control. This did not happen in one clean sweep. It happened through patience, taxation, negotiation, and force applied with more discipline than before. The crown was not merely conquering territory. It was making itself difficult to ignore. Charles VII understood that war had changed. The old nobility still mattered, but it could no longer be allowed to dominate the monarchy as if the kingdom belonged to mounted warriors alone. Gunpowder was beginning to alter warfare. Artillery would soon make fortified walls less secure. Professional soldiers would become more useful than temporary feudal levies. Kings who understood these changes could shape the future. Kings who clung to old habits risked being left behind by history. Charles chose adaptation. He strengthened royal finances. He relied on better organization. He supported a more regular military structure. The monarchy, once so dependent on the shifting loyalties of great nobles, began to develop a more durable center. This was one of the most important transformations in Valois history because it changed the very nature of kingship. The king was no longer simply first among magnates. He was becoming the architect of the state. That transition did not come without resistance. Every improvement in royal power meant a loss for someone else. Nobles who had once acted with near independence now found the crown watching more closely. Local powers that had benefited from weakness now faced stronger oversight. Cities that had negotiated with a fragile monarchy were gradually pulled into a more disciplined realm. The kingdom gained coherence, but coherence itself was a political victory over those who preferred fragmentation. This is what made the rebuilding dangerous. It was not peaceful restoration, it was contested consolidation. Charles VII's recovery also gave the Valois something they had rarely possessed for long: memory with a future. The kingdom could now look back on disaster not only as pain, but as a lesson. The long war with England had forced the monarchy to become more competent. That competence was visible in the gradual expulsion of English forces from much of France. One territory after another slipped away from foreign control. The war did not end in a single triumphant moment, but the direction had changed. The French crown was no longer retreating, it was reclaiming. Then Louis XI inherited the work. His reign was often less admired in romance and more respected in hindsight. He was not the sort of king who dazzled courtiers with noble grandeur. He was the sort of ruler who understood that power can be gathered quietly if one is patient enough. He played the politics of the realm like a man reading every pressure point on a map. He negotiated, pressured, isolated, and outmaneuvered rivals. He used intelligence, where earlier kings had sometimes relied too heavily on ritual or battlefield glory. If Charles VII rebuilt the monarchy, Louis XI sharpened it. Under him, royal authority became more penetrative. The crown did not simply rest above the kingdom, it reached into it. Noble independence was checked. Administrative systems grew more sophisticated. The monarchy became harder to resist because it became more present. A simple graphic of the period would show concentric circles tightening around the royal center, the old scattered patchwork of power slowly giving way to something more unified. But this strength carried its own tension. A stronger monarchy could impose order, yet it also created fear. Great lords who had once enjoyed broad autonomy now had reason to mistrust the crown. the more centralized France became, the more the monarchy would depend on discipline, surveillance, and a careful balance between force and consent. The Valois were no longer simply a dynasty fighting to survive. They were a dynasty building something lasting, and something that would provoke new forms of opposition. That was the paradox of success. The house that had once been endangered by weakness now faced a different danger, the burden of being strong enough to matter everywhere. And as the monarchy solidified, the kingdom's imagination widened. France was no longer only a battered medieval realm trying to recover from war. It was becoming a power with cultural ambition, diplomatic reach, and an appetite for greatness that would soon reshape the court itself. The Valois had spent decades learning how not to collapse. Now they would discover what happened when survival turned into confidence. France changed. It was a France that was filled with art, pageantry, architecture, and ambition. The court begins to shine. Kings begin to dream on a larger scale. And beneath the glitter of the Renaissance, new rivalries emerge that will test whether the monarchy's hard-won strength can endure the temptations of glory. The Valois court learned to glow. After generations defined by siege, ransom, plague, and faction, France began to look different under the later Valois kings. The kingdom did not forget its scars, but it started to decorate them. Stone palaces rose where military anxieties had once dominated thought. Tapestries softened walls that had once seemed made for defense. Music, ceremony, hunting, painting, poetry, architecture, and carefully staged magnificence all became part of the language of rule. This was not vanity alone. In the Valois world, splendor was political. To appear magnificent was to appear legitimate, powerful, and modern. A king who could gather artists, patronize scholars, host diplomats, and shape taste was a king who could project control far beyond the battlefield. France was beginning to speak the language of the Renaissance, and the Valois understood that language instinctively. They did not merely want to rule the kingdom. They wanted to define what French greatness looked like. Francis I stood at the center of this transformation. He was a king built for image as much as action, a ruler whose reign seemed to pulse with confidence, appetite, and ambition. He loved ceremony. He loved display. He loved the sense that kingship could be felt in the shimmer of fabric, the carve of stone, the echo of music in a chamber, the scale of a court where every gesture suggested order. Under him, the Valois monarchy became not just a political machine, but a theatrical one, projecting an idea of France that was bold, cultured, and self-aware. Francis I's France was a realm increasingly coherent at its core, but outward-looking in its ambitions. The crown was no longer just managing survival. It was competing for prestige. Italy drew French attention like a glittering horizon. There, beyond the Alps, lay artistic brilliance, ancient ruins, mercantile wealth, and the prestige of association with classical civilization. To meddle in Italy was to enter the heart of European competition. It was also to court disaster. Francis did both. The Italian wars transformed the Valois court from a royal household into a stage for continental rivalry. France confronted the Habsburgs, especially Charles V, whose immense dominions threatened to encircle French power. In that struggle, Francis was not simply fighting over territory. He was trying to prove that France could stand at the center of Europe rather than be pushed to its margins by a rival empire. That made every campaign more than military. It made it existential. The capture of Francis I at Pavia in 1525 became one of the dynasty's most dramatic reversals. A king with all the confidence of Renaissance magnificence was suddenly seized and held by an enemy whose power seemed to dwarf his own. the event was devastating because it pierced the carefully composed image of royal invulnerability. The court that had celebrated brilliance now had to confront vulnerability again. And yet Francis remained influential even in defeat. That too was part of the Renaissance Valois achievement. They could turn loss into performance and performance into endurance. Even captivity did not erase the cultural momentum of the reign. The court continued to attract artists and humanists. Royal patronage kept the kingdom intellectually alive. French identity began to merge with the splendor of its monarchy in a way that would shape later centuries. The crown was no longer only a source of order. It was becoming a source of style. This mattered because style itself was power. The construction of chateaux, the cultivation of humanist learning, the display of court rituals, and the absorption of Renaissance aesthetics all helped make the monarchy feel larger than the disputes of any single moment. A simple visual timeline of the era would show battles and treaties, yes, but also new palaces, new artistic patronage, and new forms of state ceremony. That combination is essential to understanding the Valois. They did not rule by force alone. They ruled by creating an atmosphere in which force felt justified by beauty. Still, ambition carried a cost. Every war in Italy drained resources. Every claim to grandeur required taxation, loans, and administrative strain. Every diplomatic contest with the Habsburgs made the kingdom more entangled in European politics. The more France reached outward, the more it risked exposing itself. The more splendid the court became, the more expensive that splendor was to maintain. And beneath the radiance of the Renaissance, the old political tensions of France had not disappeared. They had simply been dressed in finer clothes. This is what made the period so seductive and so dangerous. The Valois had finally become a dynasty that could inspire awe. Kings appeared in painted portraits, with controlled expressions and royal confidence. Queens and courtiers shaped fashion. Architects altered skylines. Intellectuals debated ideas that linked France to a larger European world. It was a time of expansion in the imagination, as much as in policy. But imagination is not the same as security. The dynasty's brilliance concealed the fact that the kingdom was taking on more risk than ever. It was growing richer in culture, more confident in its identity, and more ambitious in its claims. Those are not small achievements. They are the achievements of a powerful monarchy. Yet they also bring new enemies, new rivalries, and new expectations that the crown may not always be able to meet. By the time the Renaissance court reached its height, the Valois had built something magnificent. They had also built a system that would be tested by everything it touched. The Valois had learned how to turn survival into splendor. Now France would have to pay for that transformation. Behind the gold and the pageantry, there was a harder truth. Wars in Italy that strained the treasury, rival empires pressing from every side, and a monarchy whose rising prestige made every setback more visible. Glory had made the Valois look stronger than ever. It would soon reveal just how expensive strength could be. Greatness always arrives with a bill. By the time France had begun to shine under the later Valois, the kingdom had also begun to discover the hidden cost of looking powerful. Courtiers could admire the polished surface of royal life. Visitors could marvel at palaces, ceremonies, paintings, uniforms, and the cultivated confidence of the court. But behind that brilliance stood armies that had to be paid, alliances that had to be maintained, roads that had to be protected, and rival powers that watched French ambition with suspicion. The Valois had reached for glory, and Europe reached back. The Italian wars became the clearest expression of that danger. What began as a contest for influence across the Alps quickly turned into a grinding struggle against forces far larger than any one battlefield. France wanted prestige in Italy, but prestige in Italy meant facing the Habsburg Empire, whose vast holdings made the political map of Europe feel almost claustrophobic. A simple map of the period would show France pressed against a wide ring of competing power. Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, the Low Countries, and the many shifting states of Italy itself. There was no easy edge to push against. Every movement risked creating another enemy. Francis I embodied both the promise and the danger of this age. He was a king of charm, appetite, and image, a monarch who understood that magnificence could make authority feel inevitable. Yet he also believed that kingship demanded action on a continental scale. He wanted France to be admired, feared, and taken seriously in the grand theater of Europe. That made him daring. It also made him vulnerable. Every campaign required money. Every campaign exposed the limits of French power. Every campaign invited comparison with a rival who could often marshal greater resources. Pavia in 1525 was the moment when all of that became painfully visible. Francis went into battle with the expectations of a prince who had long been wrapped in the language of destiny. He came out a prisoner. The image of a captured king returned with brutal force. France had seen this humiliation before in the age of John II, and now it happened again under a different crown and in a different century, but with the same unbearable symbolism. A king who is seized in war cannot easily project invincibility afterward. The body of the monarch becomes a public fact, and the public fact is devastating. If the king can be captured, then the kingdom can be pressured. If the king can be held, then France itself can be made to feel negotiable. That was the terrible irony of Valois glory. The more the crown tried to look powerful, the more visible its failures became when power slipped. And yet Francis remained a capable political survivor. He negotiated, adapted, and returned to the work of kingship. That resilience is central to the Valois story. They were rarely destroyed by a single defeat. Instead, they survived by refusing to let defeat become final. But each recovery carried its own strain. Taxes rose. Administrative burdens deepened. Noble expectations became harder to manage. The court had to keep projecting confidence even when the kingdom was stretched. The Renaissance itself added to the pressure. Art, learning, and pageantry were not free ornaments. They required patronage, wealth, and stability. A monarchy that wanted to shape culture had to fund culture. A kingdom that wanted to impress Europe had to keep impressing it. The Valois court therefore became both a triumph and a burden, a shining center whose brilliance demanded constant maintenance. The palaces seemed effortless only because so much effort had been hidden behind them. And then there was the matter of memory. The dynasty's older crises never truly vanished. The wars with England had taught France what weakness looked like. The civil fractures of earlier generations had taught the crown what division could do. Those lessons never disappeared. They merely changed their form. A kingdom that had once feared invasion now feared encirclement. A monarchy that had once feared collapse now feared irrelevance. To be glorious was to be watched more closely. To be admired was to be challenged more intensely. This was the price of success. The Valois had become stronger, richer, and more culturally radiant, but they had also become more exposed. Every courtly triumph increased expectation. Every military setback looked more embarrassing against a backdrop of grandeur. Every political compromise carried the risk of seeming smaller than the image the monarchy had worked so hard to build. The dynasty was no longer fragile in the old medieval sense. It was something more complicated, powerful, admired, and under strain from its own ambition. That tension would not remain abstract for long. For while France had learned to dress authority in splendor, another danger was gathering beneath the surface of royal life. It would not come first as a foreign invasion. It would come from inside the kingdom's own spiritual and social fabric. Faith would divide communities. Noble factions would sharpen their rivalry. Dynastic confidence would give way to suspicion. And when that happened, the crown itself would begin to crack. The Valois had reached the summit of prestige, but the summit was never meant to be a resting place. Beneath the glitter of the Renaissance court, France was becoming more anxious, more contested, and more vulnerable to forces the monarchy could not simply stage manage away. Religious conflict, noble rivalry, and dynastic uncertainty were moving closer together. The crown that had once seemed to embody French unity would soon become the very thing everyone fought over. The breaking point would follow the death of a king, the rise of confessional violence, and the moment when the House of Valois stops looking like the maker of France and starts looking like the family most likely to be destroyed by it. France did not suddenly become divided. It became divided in the spaces between certainty and doubt. For much of Valois history, the crown had been the thing that held contradictions together. Even when kings were weak, even when nobles fought, even when foreign armies pressed into French territory, there remained a shared assumption that France was one realm under one sacred center. That assumption had survived war, plague, captivity, and civil faction. It had bent, but it had not fully broken. Now it began to fracture in a different way. Not through invasion, not through dynastic dispute, but through faith. When Henry II died in 1559, it did not simply mark the end of a reign. It exposed the instability beneath a monarchy that had grown powerful, ambitious, and deeply entangled in the religious tensions of its time. His death in a tournament accident was almost symbolic in its suddenness, a reminder that even the most confident displays of royal strength could collapse in an instant. What followed was not the rise of a single steady successor, but a series of reigns that struggled to contain forces already moving beyond court control. Charles IX, and later Henry III, inherited not a unified kingdom, but a pressure chamber. Across France, religious identity had become political identity. Catholic and Protestant communities were no longer simply theological categories. They had become networks of loyalty, protection, and suspicion. In towns and regions, people increasingly understood themselves not only as subjects of the king, but as members of confessional communities that might not always align with royal authority. That shift mattered because it created multiple centers of allegiance inside a single kingdom. A map of France in this period would not show clean divisions like modern borders. It would show overlapping zones of influence, fragile cities, contested regions, noble territories leaning toward different factions, and royal authority that varied in strength depending on distance from the court and the strength of local power brokers. The crown still existed at the center, but the lines connecting it to the rest of the realm were no longer reliable. The Valois court itself became a stage where these tensions played out. Catherine de' Medici, acting as regent and later as a dominant political figure, attempted to hold the monarchy together through negotiation, calculation, and balance. She understood that outright victory for any one faction risked provoking catastrophic backlash. Her strategy was often one of containment, trying to prevent full-scale collapse by managing tensions that were already explosive. But containment is not resolution. It only delays the moment of rupture. That rupture came with increasing violence. The French wars of religion were not a single conflict, but a series of overlapping crises in which massacres, assassinations, sieges, and betrayals became recurring features of political life. Cities turned on their own populations. Noble families found themselves split or aligned along confessional lines. Royal authority struggled to present itself as neutral when neutrality itself was interpreted as weakness or complicity, depending on perspective. Then came 1572. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre was not just an event. It became a memory that reshaped trust across the kingdom. Thousands of Protestants were killed in Paris and beyond in a wave of violence that spread quickly and unpredictably. Whether planned, encouraged, or uncontrolled, the result was the same. The sense that the monarchy could no longer guarantee protection to all its subjects. That perception alone was enough to change the political landscape, because once subjects lose trust in the crown's ability to protect them, they begin to seek protection elsewhere. The Valois monarchy now faced a situation it had not fully encountered before. Enemies not just outside the realm or within noble rivalries, but embedded within the population itself, organized, motivated, and increasingly willing to resist royal direction. Henry III inherited this world of instability. He was a king who struggled to maintain authority over a kingdom that seemed to move faster than his capacity to control it. The court, once a center of cultural brilliance, became a place surrounded by suspicion, factional maneuvering, and growing fear that the monarchy was no longer the final arbiter of French life. Noble leagues formed, particularly the powerful Catholic League, which at times operated with its own agenda, challenging the crown's authority in the name of religious purity and political necessity. Henry III's reign would not look like progress or decline in a straight line. It would look like escalation, assassinations, negotiations, shifting alliances, temporary settlements, renewed conflict, and increasing desperation all appeared in rapid succession. The rhythm of governance itself became unstable. At the heart of this instability was a deeper transformation. The monarchy was no longer the uncontested center of legitimacy. It was one actor among several, albeit still the most important, but no longer the only one that mattered. That change is difficult to overstate. For centuries, the Valois crown had represented the idea that France had a single political heart. Now that idea was under sustained pressure. Henry III attempted to reassert control, including through decisive and controversial actions against powerful rivals. But each attempt at consolidation seemed to generate new resistance. The more force the crown applied, the more it revealed the depth of opposition already forming. Even victory in one moment did not guarantee stability in the next. And so the dynasty reached its final crisis, not because it had suddenly become weaker than before, but because the conditions around it had changed faster than it could adapt. The Valois had once survived by being flexible, by learning from catastrophe, by rebuilding after collapse. Now they faced a form of fragmentation that did not resolve itself after a single disaster. It multiplied. The crown that had once rebuilt France now found itself struggling to hold France together at all. And in that struggle, the dynasty moved toward its end. By the final decades of Valois rule, the kingdom no longer experienced crisis as an interruption of normal life. Crisis had become the normal life. Royal authority was contested not only by foreign enemies, but by internal leagues, noble factions, religious movements, and regional powers that all believed they had legitimate claims to influence the fate of France. The monarchy was still sacred in theory, but in practice it was constantly challenged, reshaped, and resisted. The Valois story was ending, The crown was surrounded by rivals. A kingdom was being pulled apart by belief and ambition. And the dynasty was no longer merely enduring history, but being consumed by it from within. A dynasty devoured from within. By the time Henry III ruled, France no longer felt like a single argument with different opinions. It felt like several arguments happening at once, each one convinced it represented the true France. The crown was still there, still crowned, still sacred in ceremony, still the formal center of law and legitimacy. But its authority no longer moved cleanly through the kingdom. It bent, stalled, and broke against layers of resistance that were no longer temporary crises, but semi-permanent structures of power. Noble leagues, religious factions, armed cities, and regional strongholds all behaved as though they had their own share in defining what France should become. The monarchy had not disappeared. It had been surrounded. A simple map of late Valois France would show something unsettling. The capital still anchored the center, but around it the kingdom would appear textured rather than unified. Zones of Catholic League influence in one direction, Protestant strongholds in another, wavering regions in between, and noble territories acting with increasing independence from royal instruction. The lines of authority no longer pointed cleanly toward Paris. They branched outward, competing with one another. Henry III tried to rule in the narrow space between these forces. It was an impossible position. Every attempt at compromise risked alienating one faction. Every attempt at force risked escalating resistance. The monarchy was no longer simply deciding policy. It was constantly managing survival. The court itself became a theater of suspicion. Advisors were distrusted. Alliances were temporary. Even gestures of reconciliation were interpreted through the lens of potential manipulation. In this atmosphere, violence ceased to be exceptional. It became structural. The Catholic League, powerful and ideologically driven, emerged as one of the most formidable internal forces in the kingdom. It did not see itself as rebelling against France. It saw itself as defending France from corruption. That distinction mattered. Because when a faction believes it is the true guardian of the state, it does not behave like a conventional rebel. It behaves like an alternative government. This created a situation in which loyalty itself was fractured. Some nobles remained loyal to the crown out of tradition, fear, or calculation. Others shifted allegiance depending on local pressure or ideological alignment. Cities negotiated their own safety. Armies aligned not only with kings, but with causes. The idea of a single French political body began to feel less like a fact and more like a hope struggling against reality. Henry III's reign became defined by this narrowing corridor of control. He attempted decisive action against rival power structures, including the elimination of key figures who threatened royal authority. But each act of resolution seemed to deepen the conflict rather than settle it. The more the crown acted, the more visible the depth of division became. Authority was no longer something that could simply be asserted. It had to be constantly re-earned in a landscape that no longer guaranteed obedience. Then came the moment when even the illusion of central control began to collapse. Paris itself, the symbolic heart of the kingdom, became a contested space. The city was not merely a capital. It was a political actor in its own right. When factions controlled Paris, they controlled not just geography, but narrative. They could claim to speak for France while the king was physically present but politically constrained. That reversal, a king inside his own capital but not fully in control of it, captured the essence of late Valois fragility. At this stage, the monarchy was no longer devoured in one dramatic act. It was being consumed slowly, by accumulated pressures that had each once seemed manageable. Religious war drained resources and trust. Noble leagues eroded central authority. Regional autonomy increased in practice even when not recognized in law. Assassinations and retaliations blurred the line between governance and survival. Every layer of the system absorbed strain until strain itself became the defining condition of rule. And yet, Henry III remained king. That persistence mattered, because it shows that the Valois did not fall because the monarchy ceased to exist. They fell because the monarchy ceased to be the only thing that existed. France had become a landscape of competing sovereignties layered over one another. The crown was still the highest symbol, but symbols alone cannot resolve conflicts that have become structural. The dynasty that had once inherited a broken line and turned it into a rebuilt monarchy now found itself trapped in a kingdom where rebuilding was no longer enough. Something more final was approaching, not a gradual fading, but an ending. By the final years of the Valois, survival no longer meant restoration or recovery. It meant endurance inside a system that had lost its unity. Henry III stood at the center of a kingdom where legitimacy was contested, loyalty was conditional, and violence had become a regular instrument of political life. The monarchy still existed, but it no longer commanded uncontested authority over the forces shaping France. The final collapse of this fragile balance found itself in the last act of Henry III's reign. The assassination that marked the end of the Valois line and the closing of a dynasty that had ruled through catastrophe, reconstruction, splendor, and fragmentation, until there was nothing left to hold together. By the time Henry III reached the final stretch of his reign, France no longer behaved like a kingdom with a clear center. It behaved like a battlefield searching for one. The Valois crown still existed, still crowned in ceremony, still recognized in law, still wrapped in the sacred language of monarchy that had defined France for centuries. But beneath that continuity, authority had become fragmented into competing realities. The Catholic League claimed to defend the true France. Protestant forces defended their own vision of survival. Noble factions negotiated power as if it were divisible. Cities acted as political agents. Even loyalty itself had become conditional, shifting with fear, belief, and circumstance. Henry III stood at the center of this instability, but the center no longer guaranteed control. He was a king surrounded by France, rather than commanding it. A map of the kingdom in his final years would not show a unified territory with clear obedience radiating from Paris. It would show overlapping zones of influence, contested corridors of movement, fortified cities acting independently, and regions where royal authority existed more in theory than in practice. The crown was still the highest symbol, but symbols no longer settled disputes that had become existential. What made Henry III's position so fragile was not only opposition from enemies, but erosion from within the concept of monarchy itself. The idea that a single ruler could embody the unity of France had been under strain for generations. War had tested it. Religious conflict had fractured it. Noble ambition had competed with it. By the time Henry III ruled, that idea no longer felt self-evident. It had to be defended constantly, and defense alone was no longer enough. Paris, once the unquestioned heart of royal authority, became a contested space of symbolic and practical control. The city's political identity shifted depending on who held influence within it. In moments of League dominance, it became a stronghold of opposition ideology. In moments of royal assertion, it became a precarious seat of power, surrounded by hostility. The king's presence in such a city no longer guaranteed stability. It merely made instability visible. Henry III attempted to restore control through decisive political action against rival factions and leaders. But each attempt deepened the sense that France was no longer governed by a single coherent system. Instead, power responded to pressure like a fluid environment, redistributing itself whenever force was applied. Even success could not stabilize the situation for long. The structure beneath the crown had become too fractured. In this environment, assassination ceased to be an anomaly. It became a language of politics. And so the final act unfolded. Henry III was assassinated in 1589 by a religious zealot aligned with forces that believed they were acting in defense of France's spiritual and political future. The act itself was abrupt, but its meaning was not. It represented the culmination of decades in which authority had been contested not only by foreign enemies or noble rivals, but by competing visions of what France itself was supposed to be. With his death, the direct Valois line came to an end. But the significance of that ending is not contained only in the moment of assassination. It lies in what the assassination revealed: that the monarchy, once capable of absorbing crisis after crisis, had reached a point where internal division no longer resolved itself through recovery. It resolved itself through replacement. The Valois had ruled through catastrophe for more than 2 centuries. They had inherited a disputed crown and turned it into a functioning monarchy. They had survived foreign invasion, internal rebellion, plague, civil war, and ideological fracture. They had built a centralized state, cultivated a Renaissance court, and shaped the image of French kingship into something admired across Europe. And yet the final generation discovered a limit to even that resilience. When a kingdom no longer agrees on what binds it together, even survival becomes unstable. The House of Valois did not vanish because it failed in a single decisive moment. It ended because the conditions that had once made recovery possible no longer guaranteed unity. The mechanisms of restoration that had carried earlier kings through crisis were no longer sufficient to contain the scale of division that had emerged. When Henry III fell, it was not only a king who died. It was the final attempt of a dynasty to hold together a kingdom that had begun to outgrow the structures that once defined it. And with that, the Valois story reached its end. Not in triumph, not in simple collapse, but in the quiet conclusion of a long struggle to make unity survive against forces that increasingly pulled it apart. The death of Henry III did not erase the world the Valois had built. It revealed it. Behind the collapse of the direct line stood a transformed France, more centralized than the kingdom Philip VI had inherited, more administratively capable than the fractured realm of the early war years, more culturally confident than the battered state that had once depended on miracles of survival. The Valois had not simply ruled France. They had reshaped it under pressure so intense that nearly every institution of monarchy had been tested and redefined. The final question, then, is not only how the dynasty ended, but what it left behind when it did. When the House of Valois ended, it did not leave behind a vacuum. It left behind a structure. That distinction matters. Dynasties can disappear, but the worlds they build tend to linger. In France's case, the Valois did not merely occupy the throne for more than 2 centuries. They reshaped what the throne meant, how it functioned, and what people expected from it. Even in collapse, their legacy remained embedded in the machinery of the kingdom they had spent generations trying to hold together. What they left behind was not a story of uninterrupted triumph. It was something more complicated and more durable, a monarchy that had learned how to survive catastrophe. The Valois inherited a fractured realm and slowly taught it how to act like a state. They turned succession crises into moments of legal definition. They turned military disaster into institutional reform. They turned humiliation into reconstruction. Each crisis stripped something away, but each recovery added something new. Tax systems that reached further, armies that became more professional, administration that grew more consistent, and a royal identity that became harder to ignore, even in moments of weakness. France in this era would tell that story without words. At the beginning, it was a show about a patchwork of semi-independent territories, overlapping loyalties, and uncertain boundaries of control. By the end, it would be a far more coherent kingdom, still not perfectly unified, still not free of internal tension, but unmistakably more centralized, more legible, and more capable of acting as a single political body. That transformation came at a cost. The Valois never ruled a quiet France. Nearly every generation of their dynasty was shaped by pressure that threatened to break the kingdom apart. Claims from England, internal noble rivalry, plague, peasant revolt, civil war, religious fragmentation, and the constant burden of legitimizing authority in a world that was always willing to question it. Their reign is best understood not as a steady ascent, but as repeated survival under conditions that repeatedly made survival uncertain. And yet, survival, repeated long enough, becomes something like progress. They also left behind a cultural inheritance that outlived their political line. The Renaissance court they cultivated did not vanish with them. It became part of the identity of French kingship itself. The expectation that power should be expressed not only through force, but through refinement. Not only through command, but through patronage. Not only through authority, but through spectacle. France would continue to define itself in part through that combination of strength and style. Even the conflicts that shattered the final generations of the Valois carried forward their influence. The wars of religion revealed a kingdom capable of tearing itself apart, but also capable of searching for a new equilibrium afterward. The very intensity of that fragmentation was, in a sense, made possible by the level of centralization the Valois had already achieved. A weak state cannot fracture so dramatically. Only a strong one can. That is one of the most uncomfortable truths about their legacy. The Valois built a France that was powerful enough to endure crisis, and powerful enough for crisis to matter at a national scale. When Henry III died and the direct line ended, France did not revert to its earlier form. It moved forward, carrying the institutions, habits, expectations, and tensions that had accumulated under Valois rule. Even the transition to the next dynasty did not erase what had been built. It simply inherited it, along with the unresolved questions the Valois had spent centuries trying to manage. How do you hold together a kingdom large enough to fracture? How do you maintain unity in a world where loyalty is divided by belief, region, ambition, and identity? How do you turn survival into stability without creating new forms of conflict in the process? The House of Valois never fully answered those questions, but they changed the terms in which they were asked. And that may be their most enduring legacy. They did not give France perfection. They gave it endurance. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, be sure to like the video, share it with fellow history enthusiasts, and subscribe for more deep dives into the people, civilizations, battles, myths, and moments that shaped our world. Leave your thoughts and theories in the comments below. Your perspective might inspire a future video. Until next time, keep exploring history, because the past is never truly gone.